So today I'm going to be reviewing Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. This is my third read through of Pride and Prejudice, and I have so many thoughts, and I don't know how this is gonna go. Seems like my spoiler-free reviews are always so well put together, and I have all my points laid out, and then my spoiler reviews, I just kind of wing it, so apologies. I'm winging it. Also, this is spoiler-filled. I'm not giving you a description because you know, so let's talk. Things that I love about this novel. If you don't already know, I love Pride and Prejudice. I think the first thing I want to talk about is how deep and brilliant this novel is. It's a romance, but it's so much more than a romance. It's really a look at the culture of Jane Austen's time, but not just a look, a very critical look. Not only are the characters hilarious in her novels, but also her take on her society, her critical take on her society is not just critical, but it's also so humorous. The way she portrays these characters, she's so intentional with each of them. And I kind of want to go into how I view these characters, and I'd love to hear how you guys feel about my interpretation and how you've interpreted it differently. First, I want to start with the source, and that's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Bennet is hilarious. He's probably one of the best characters in the novel. We start out with him and Mrs. Bennet. Oh my goodness. We start out with him having discussions about Mrs. Bennet's game plan. She wants to marry off her 5 daughters to the most wealthy men she can. And this is an understandable goal because Mr. and Mrs. Bennet have 5 daughters and no sons. And according to the time that this is written in, women don't have that many rights or abilities beyond themselves, which means that when Mr. Bennet passes away, his family fortune will be passed on to a cousin and not his daughters because it can only be passed on to a man. So the women need to marry up or else the family's gonna live in poverty. So she wants to get her daughters married off, and she wants to get them married off now and to the wealthiest bachelor she can find for them. Mr. Bennet doesn't really care that much. He's just kind of chilling, living his life, and everybody can do whatever they want. This is a pretty bold situation for him to take, because if everybody just does what they want, and doesn't strategically marry, then it could be really bad for their family. But his humor is what makes him so lovable. Not just his morality, not just his care for his daughter's happiness over how nice their dresses are. He matches Mrs. Bennet's ridiculousness with humor. Like in the beginning of the novel when Mrs. Bennet says, "You have no care for my nerves." And Mr. Bennet's response is, "Depend upon it, my dear. I'm well acquainted with your nerves. I've known them for what does he say, 20 years? Maybe 30 years? I don't remember the exact line, but everything out of his mouth is basically a shot at his family. He's either taking a shot at his wife or at one of his daughters, except for Elizabeth, because she's his favorite. He has a very insulting humor, but we love to see it. Let's go back to Mrs. Bennet. Like I said, her desire to get her daughters married off wealthy is understandable because in this time, if they're not married off wealthy, they're kind of screwed because of their current position for their family. But Mrs. Bennet, she's not written to be a very likable character. She's meant to be an exaggeration of everything that's wrong with society at the time. She's intentionally over the top and overly demanding and ridiculous. Everything that you hate about her, you're supposed to, because she's supposed to be a reflection of everything that's wrong with the way culture is trying to marry off their daughters to the top bidder, essentially. Then you have Elizabeth, which I really just think has Jane Austen's humor. She is quick and witty and sassy and, well, quite Prejudice. Obviously, the book's called Pride and Prejudice. We're talking about Mr. Darcy's pride and Elizabeth's prejudice, and that's really what gets them into the mess that they're in. Mr. Darcy is a socially awkward, shy, sweet little bean that is quite wealthy and is afraid that everybody that's interested in him is really only interested in his money, so he's pretty standoffish because he can't really tell who likes him for him and who likes him for his pocketbook. Then you have Elizabeth, who really couldn't care less about any of that. She's just trying to find someone worth her time. And when Mr. Darcy is rude and insulting from the get-go, she writes him off pretty quick. Her prejudice toward Mr. Darcy shows, of course, throughout the whole drama between him and Mr. Wickham and the lies that he tells and all that goes down there. She immediately assumes Mr. Darcy at fault in every situation that presents itself. And she really doesn't want to hear his side of the story. She just expects him to be the jerk. This isn't such an unreasonable expectation because he does present himself as a jerk to start off. And so she latches onto that and decides he's a one-layered human, a jerk. That's all he's got to show for himself. Then later when she confronts him, he doesn't defend himself. So her misunderstanding isn't terrible, but it is too much. She definitely has an idea about a person, latches onto it, and expects that that's the only layer to that person. But don't worry, she has an amazing character arc. Mr. Darcy is one of the sweetest, most considerate, amazing men ever, but he's presented as such a jerk. I remember the first time I read Pride and Prejudice, I didn't like him for about half the book. I remember thinking, he sucks, and I don't get why so many people fall for jerks when they read books. You like the guy that treats the woman like she's dirt. Why do we do this? And I thought Mr. Darcy was just another one of those male leads that likes to insult and be mean to everyone around them, but somehow he's romantic because he's hot. But nay, sir, Mr. Darcy is actually so sweet. It's just that he presents himself poorly because of his pride, because of his fear that people like him for the wrong reasons, and because he's just a shy, socially awkward fella, and it's adorable. But when the whole drama goes down with Lydia, and he sees that Jane is genuinely in distress, even in his proposal, he's a jerk. He essentially says, your family is not worth my time, and I don't want them as in-laws. And I have tried so hard not to care for you, but despite my greatest efforts, I can't help it. I love you. Marry me. And she responds with, that was the most insulting way you possibly could have proposed to me. Let me tell you why you suck. And then she pulls out her imaginary list of all the things he's done wrong that she's been keeping track of this entire novel. And he responds with, some of that's fair. A lot of it's a misunderstanding. And she essentially says, oh, I'm not done talking yet, and continues to lay into him until he gets mad enough that he just leaves. It's honestly one of the best proposals ever, only narrowly beating out when Mr. Collins proposes to her and then rejects her rejection by saying, oh, women and their games. It's fine, you can reject me for now. I'll ask again later and then maybe you'll say yes. The proposals in this book are, oh my goodness, the way people treat each other, the way people assume things about one another. Once again, a hilarious take on the ridiculousness of the time. You might slightly look at somebody funny at a ball and you've ruined your reputation because the way society worked at this time was just full of a bunch of nuances and ridiculous expectations. And she played on that by mostly by Mr. Collins's ridiculous rejection of her rejection of his proposal. He's reading into everything and expecting that this is how things are supposed to go because of their culture and because of his assumptions about women. And she's like, no, I'm speaking bluntly to you. And he's like, I don't know what that means. Oh boy, this is all over the place. Sorry. But when Lydia does her deed and Elizabeth is distraught over it while she's with Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy, this is when he truly shows who he is. Even though he's been harshly rejected by Elizabeth, and he knows that he's never going to end up with her because she doesn't want anything to do with her, he still cares for her so much that he runs off to save the day. He uses his own money to pay off the scum, essentially pay him to be married to Lydia, and then swears them into secrecy, doesn't want Elizabeth to know that it was him because he's not trying to bribe Elizabeth to marry him. He's not trying to convince her of his goodness. He's just trying to love her in the only way he knows how and the only way he's allowed, secretly. He just wants her happiness. He just wants her to not be so distraught over her sister and the family's reputation and everything that comes along with it. He wants to make things okay for her. He wants her to be happy, and he doesn't care if he never gets credit for that happiness. He just wants to see that she's okay. This is the beauty of Mr. Darcy, a truly, genuinely good guy, willing to see the horrible things that are happening around him due to people's horrible decisions, and still he'll sacrifice his own time and efforts and money for the sake of just making sure that the woman he loves is happy, even if it's apart from him. Mr. Darcy's true and honest love for Elizabeth, he's initially turned off by her. He initially doesn't even find her attractive. But as he gets to know her, he falls in love with her. And then his act of love isn't even to profess his love or make amends or convince her that he's wonderful. He's accepted her rejection. He deserved the rejection, quite frankly. That proposal was horrible. He's accepted his fate, and all he cares about right now is just loving her in the only way he's allowed, making sure that she's happy. It's beautiful. And when she realizes his true kindness and his honest nature, then she falls in love with that. Not with his pocketbook, not with his looks, not with his reputation or what he could offer her. She falls in love with the honest goodness of who he is to the people he truly loves. And it's beautiful. Now I want to back up a little bit because I love Jane Austen's take on love in this novel. Jane Austen's take on love was so interesting because she didn't want to do that. She actually started out with an intense dislike and presumptions about each other that weren't true. She doesn't have an emotional love between them. She has a logical love between these two characters where they only fall for each other after they get to know each other's true self. And then she shows an emotional love in Lydia. Lydia's a brat, and she's not a likable character. My goodness, she can't buy her sister's lunch because she buys a bonnet that she doesn't even find pretty, but she reckons she would rather buy it than not, even though she doesn't like it. There's not much to like about Lydia. Then she runs off and finds herself in a scandal, which in this time of day is a really big deal. She doesn't even regret it. She doesn't even feel bad about it. She doesn't feel bad that her future spouse is asking for bribery to be married to her. And then when she's married, she basically writes off her sisters and she says, a married woman doesn't really have time to write letters. Someone else will write you letters. But she gets involved in an emotional affair, in an emotional relationship, and she runs off and she doesn't think about culture or her family or what's expected of her or how it will affect anyone around her. She's essentially a parallel of Elizabeth, but done in a really different way. Elizabeth is also really selfish in the beginning of this novel, but not in a negative way. Mr. Collins, I believe, is the one that's supposed to inherit the wealth when Mr. Bennet passes away. So when he proposes to Elizabeth, if Elizabeth would accept that proposal, that would be huge for the family. It would mean that they wouldn't lose their family fortune. That's why Mrs. Bennet was so upset with her, because this is the perfect marriage. But Elizabeth doesn't care. She wants to be happy. She doesn't just want an arrangement. She wants someone that she could actually live happily with, not just tolerate. Then when Mr. Darcy proposes and she turns him down vehemently, this would be an even better arrangement because now they're going to have even more fortune. Again, taking care of the family that's at risk for poverty. Again, she chooses what she wants over what's best for the family. This is a logical, healthy take on what is essentially a scandal and a slap in the face to her family. Jane Austen is showing her time and the culture and choosing to make Elizabeth really veer from what would be expected from a heroine of a story. But then she also shows the same sort of mentality and actions in Lydia and shows how it can be detrimental if you do it in an incredibly selfish way instead of an incredibly selfish and emotional way instead of in a very logical way. I don't know, maybe I've misinterpreted everything in this novel, but to me, I see Elizabeth and Lydia's over here, Lydia and Elizabeth as parallels of two people making similar decisions but with totally different mindsets and doing it in totally different ways. And one is terrible for the family and one looks terrible on the surface but ends up being really beautiful. But it also could have not been beautiful. What if Elizabeth didn't then fall in love with Mr. Darcy and the family really did fall into demise and poverty because of the choices Elizabeth made? She shouldn't be responsible for marrying in order for her family not to starve, but also she kind of is. I love this novel because it's a look at society and it's a mockery of so many parts of how society at the time was wrong. It's scandalous and it's thrilling and it's practically a soap opera with everything that goes down in this novel. Every character, almost every character, has an incredible arc, whether it's a positive arc or a negative arc. Everybody changes so much in this novel. The humor is on point. The look at culture of the day is on point. And the romance is beautiful. I don't know how good of a review this is because I didn't really go over the different things that went down in this book, but I guess I just talked about why I think this book is so good. It's not just a beautiful romance, which it is a beautiful romance, but it has so many layers to it and really helps us to see society at the time in a really unique and critical way. I love this book. I would love to talk more with you about it. I'd love to chat with you about the characters that I have decided I know so very well. I'd love to hear how you see them differently or the same, or your thoughts on this book. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and I post my reviews on off days. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.